Hello and welcome back to A Christmas Carol Annotate with me. We are now towards the end of stave 4. In the last episode we had a look at three really important characters, the charwoman, Mrs. Dilber and Old Joe, and they were shown to be selling off a dead person's possessions. The way they spoke about this dead person was really derogatory. They spoke about him really lowly, clearly have no respect for him, and it's important that we know that this dead person is Scrooge, but Scrooge doesn't know at this time that it is him that they're talking about, and he's actually the dead person that they're selling the possessions of. So towards the end of this section, he will find out that it's him, and we'll have a look at how he responds to that. But right now we are going to get into another really important scene within the novella, another scene that could potentially come up in the exam, so it's really important that we understand it really well, just in case it does come up. Okay, so let's get started. "Spirit," he said, "this is a fearful place. In leaving it, I shall not leave its lesson." So just after he has left the Old Joe's shop, he's now been taken to somewhere else, and he says that he shall not leave its lesson. So we see an almost redeemed Scrooge here. The harsh lesson seems to have worked. "Trust me, let us go." Still the ghost pointed with an unmoved finger to the head. So he's saying, you know, we don't need to see any more. I've learnt my lesson. But obviously the ghost is saying there's plenty more to learn. And remember, this ghost doesn't say anything. He just points. And we've already spoken about why we think that the ghost doesn't speak. So if you haven't seen the previous episodes, it's important to go back, because it is very likely that you get a extract from this stave in the exam, and if you do, then you do need to understand why potentially the ghost doesn't speak. What is it about the ghost why has Dickens created this ghost that doesn't speak? "I understand you," Scrooge returned, "and I would do it if I could, but I have not the power. Spirit, I have not the power." So he's saying, I understand that I need to move forward, but I don't have the power to move forward. Again it seemed to look upon him. "If there is any person in the town who feels emotion caused by this man's death," said Scrooge, quite agonized, "show that person to me, Spirit, I beseech you." So I said earlier that he doesn't know that it's him that has died, but he's saying that if there's anybody else that's been affected by this person's death, as in this man's death, or this man has affected somebody negatively, then please show me them. The phantom spread its dark robe before him for a moment, like a wing, and withdrawing it, revealed a room by daylight where a mother and her children were. She was expecting someone, and with anxious eagerness, for she walked up and down the room, started at every sound, looked out from the window, glanced at the clock, tried, but in vain, to work with her needle, and could hardly bear the voices of the children in their play. At length the long-expected knock was heard. She hurried to the door and met her husband, a man whose face was careworn and depressed. So in this scene we meet some more minor characters, but these characters again show what sort of effect Scrooge had on people's lives, the devastating effect he had on people's lives. And here we've got the description of her husband's face being careworn and depressed, even though he's young. Now, Scrooge is a debt collector, and this person was in debt with him, and this is the effect he has on people who are in debt with him. He leaves them looking and feeling careworn and depressed, though he was young. There was a remarkable expression in it now, a kind of serious delight of which he felt ashamed, and which he struggled to repress. So he's returned home. He went to see Scrooge to ask if he could extend the deadline for the debt, but he's returned not looking the way his wife expected him to look. He seems to look a little bit happy, even though he's trying to hide it. He seems quite happy, but he's ashamed to be happy. He sat down to the dinner that had been hoarding for him by the fire, and when she asked him faintly what news, which was not until after a long silence, he appeared embarrassed how to answer. So the wife has been hoarding the husband's dinner by the fire. This is a loving gesture, so Scrooge can see the kind people he affects with his miserliness. "Is it good?" she said, or bad to help him? Bad, he answered. We are quite ruined. No, there is hope yet, Caroline. If he relents, she said, amazed. There is. Nothing is past hope if such a miracle has happened. He is past relenting, said her husband. He is dead. So he's just broken the news to his wife Caroline about the fact that their debt collector Scrooge has actually died. So there was no need for them to ask for an extension on their deadline. She was a mild and patient creature, if her face spoke truth, but she was thankful in her soul to hear it, and she said so with clasped hands. This description here is really important, mild and patient creature. We'll see this same description of Tiny Tim in the next scene as well. The adjectives mild and patient are used to describe the poor as morally good. She prayed forgiveness the next moment and was sorry, but the first was the emotion of her heart. So this brief religious gesture is included to remind us of the fear of the Victorians' fear of retribution, but also proves to Scrooge that the poor are good and moral people. So she feels really guilty for being happy at the fact that somebody has died, and straight away she seeks forgiveness. And this religious gesture is supposed to be something that the Victorian readership, so the contemporary readership, would have been able to relate to, but also to show that the poor people are actually good people. Now, obviously, we've discussed before how poor people were not seen as good people, were seen as morally corrupt, were seen as idle, and that's why the rich felt so lowly towards them. But throughout Dickens's work, he always makes the poor people look as good as possible, just so that the contemporary readership can empathise with them and can see how ignorant they are in their views. What the half-drunken woman whom I told you of last night said to me when I tried to see him and obtain a week's delay, and what I thought was a mere excuse to avoid me, turns out to have been quite true. He was not only very ill, but dying then. To whom will our debt be transferred? I don't know, but before that time we shall be ready with the money, and even though we were not, it would be a bad fortune indeed to find so merciless a creditor in his successor. We may sleep tonight with light hearts, Caroline. Yes, soften it as they would, their hearts were lighter. The children's faces, hushed and clustered round to hear what they so little understood, were brighter, and it was a happier house for this man's death. The only emotion that the ghost could show him, caused by the event, was one of pleasure. So this is another devastating reminder to Scrooge of the impact he has had on those around him. Dickens is building up the sympathetic images of poor families and the impact of poverty through the Cratchits and now this family as well. Let me see some tenderness connected with the death, said Scrooge, or that dark chamber spirit which we left just now will be forever present to me. The ghost conducted him through several streets familiar to his feet, and as they went along, Scrooge looked here and there to find himself, but nowhere was he to be seen. So he's still looking for himself in the streets, thinking he's alive. He's not realised at all that he's actually the dead person everybody's speaking about. They entered poor Bob Cratchit's house, the dwelling he had visited before, and found the mother and the children seated round the fire. Quiet, very quiet. So the repetition of quiet is there to emphasise that the joy has left the Cratchit's household. The noisy little Cratchits were as still as statues in one corner and sat looking up at Peter, who had a book before him. So this simile, still as statues, is there to show how lifeless their life has become. This is a good quote to compare with the previous exuberance we saw during them. So the previous energy and gusto and excitement of the children during the Cratchit Christmas dinner. So if you were to compare this quotation with that would be really, really good in an exam. The mother and her daughters were engaged in sewing, but surely they were very quiet. And he took a child and set him in the midst of them. Where had Scrooge heard those words? He had not dreamed them. The boy must have read them out as he and the spirit crossed the threshold. Why did he not go on? The mother laid her work upon the table and put her hand up to her face. The colour hurts my eyes, she said. The colour? Ah, poor Tiny Tim. "They're better now again," said Cratchit's wife. "It makes them weak by candlelight, and I wouldn't show weak eyes to your father when he comes home. For the world, it must be near his time." So Bob has gone to visit Tiny Tim's grave. Scrooge doesn't know this just yet, but he's beginning to understand a bit. Something's not right. "Past it, rather," Peter answered, shutting up his book. "But I think he has walked a little slower than he used these few last evenings, Mother." They were very quiet again. At last she said, and in a steady, cheerful voice that only faltered once, "I have known him walk with Tiny Tim upon his shoulder, very fast indeed." "And so have I," cried Peter. "Often." "And so have I," exclaimed another. So had all. "But he was very light to carry," she resumed, intent upon her work. So this description of Tiny Tim being very light to carry reveals that he was not a burden to anyone. Perhaps a comment that the poor are not a burden, but need to be helped. So Tim was a beacon of hope to Bob, not a burden. And his father loved him so that it was no trouble. The repetition of "no trouble" again highlights how Tiny Tim was not a burden on them, despite their not being able to afford the health care he required. "And there is your father at the door." She hurried out to meet him, and little Bob in his comforter, he had need of it, poor fellow, came in. His tea was ready for him on the hob, and they all tried who should help him to it most. So again, we've got the description of his tea being ready for him, his dinner being ready for him, is again included to show that the Cratchits are a caring family, just like we saw in the previous poor family as well, where the wife was hoarding her husband's dinner. Here, Mrs. Cratchit is hoarding, or has got Bob Cratchit's dinner ready for him as well. Another loving gesture to show how considerate they are of one another. Then the two young Cratchits got up on his knees and laid each child a little cheek against his face, as if they said, "Don't mind it, father. Don't be grieved." The little Cratchits showing their affection for Bob shows the strength of the family, and how they are pulling together in this terrible aftermath of Tiny Tim's death. Bob was very cheerful with them and spoke pleasantly to all the family. He looked at the work upon the table and praised the industry and speed of Mrs. Cratchit and the girls. So again, he's just like he praised during the Christmas dinner. He's again praising Mrs. Cratchit and the girls who have organised this dinner and prepared the table. Again, so despite his grief, so his bereavement, despite the deep sadness that he's feeling at the loss of Tim, he's still not lost his optimistic side, his optimism, his kind side, where he's constantly showing gratitude, constantly showing appreciation. And it's really important to notice these things because, like I said, there is the likelihood that an extract on the Cratchits could come up, but even if it doesn't come up, it's something that should be mentioned. The fact how Dickens presents the poor is really, really important, and there's so many different ways he presents them. "They would be done long before Sunday," he said. "Sunday? You went today then, Robert?" said his wife. "Yes, my dear," returned Bob. "I wish you could have gone. It would have done you good to see how green a place it is. But you'll see it often. I promised him that I would walk there on a Sunday." "My little, little child," cried Bob. "My little child." He broke down all at once. So when Bob breaks down, it is because of his uncontrollable grief, which stems from how close he was to Tim. He couldn't help it. If he could have helped it, and his child would have been farther apart, perhaps, than they were. He left the room and went upstairs into the room above, which was lighted cheerfully and hung with Christmas. There was a chair set close beside the child, and there were signs of someone having been there lately. Poor Bob sat down in it, and when he had thought a little and composed himself, he kissed the little face. He was reconciled to what had happened, and went down again quite happy. So Bob goes up to Tim's old room and imagines sitting beside him, so he's imagining Tim is still there. The death is recent, and he finds solace in the memory of Tiny Tim. They drew about the fire and talked, the girls and mother working still. So again Dickens shows the family pulling together in "they drew about the fire and talked." Bob told them of the extraordinary kindness of Mr. Scrooge's nephew, whom he had scarcely seen but once, and who, meeting him in the street that day and seeing that he looked just a little down, you know, said Bob, inquired what had happened to distress him. So Scrooge's nephew showing extraordinary kindness to someone he had scarcely seen but once is the ghost showing Scrooge the power of humanity, and therefore Dickens showing his readers the same thing, the power of humanity, the power of kindness, the power of being considerate and mindful of how you interact with people. On which, said Bob, for he is the pleasantest spoken gentleman you ever heard, I told him, I am heartily sorry for it, Mr. Cratchit, he said, and heartily sorry for your good wife. By the by, how he ever knew that, I don't know. Knew what, my dear? Why, that you were a good wife, replied Bob. Everybody knows that, said Peter. Very well observed, my boy, cried Bob. So Bob joking with his wife here shows his strength again, and his affection as well. All the positive representations of the poor are deliberate messages from Dickens to his readers. So perhaps you'd like to pause here and start listing all of the different positive representations of the poor that Dickens presents within this novel and has presented so far, just to see if you can recall from memory the different events that happen. I hope they do. Heartily sorry, he said, for your good wife. If I can be of any service to you in any way, he said, giving me his card, that's where I live. Pray, come to me. Now, pray means just please in this instance. Now it wasn't, cried Bob. For the sake of anything he might be able to do for us, so much as for his kind way, that this was quite delightful. It really seemed as if he had known our Tiny Tim, and felt with us. I'm sure he's a good soul, said Mrs. Cratchit. You would be surer of it, my dear, returned Bob, if you saw and spoke to him. I shouldn't be at all surprised. Mark what I say, if he got Peter a better situation. Only hear that, Peter, said Mrs. Cratchit. And then, cried one of the girls, Peter will be keeping company with someone and setting up for himself. Get along with you, retorted Peter, grinning. So they're all just joking about Peter getting a job through Fred's goodwill. It's just as likely as not, said Bob, one of these days, though there's plenty of time for that, my dear. But however and whenever we part from one another, I am sure we shall none of us forget poor Tiny Tim, shall we, or this first parting that there was among us. So this line, we shall none of us forget poor Tiny Tim, emphasises the positive impact Tim had on his family. Remember that Tim is a representation of the poor. So Dickens is again reminding his readers to look beyond themselves and think about their own impact on society. Never, father, cried they all. And I know, said Bob, I know, my dears, that when we recollect how patient and how mild he was, although he was a little child, we shall not quarrel easily among ourselves and forget poor Tiny Tim in doing it. So this is the same description that I mentioned earlier, where Dickens described that poor wife. You know, she's called Caroline, and she was waiting for her husband, and they were in debt with Scrooge. The exact same words are used here for Tiny Tim, patient and mild, and this isn't just a coincidence. It is very much deliberate. It's a really nice way of seeing how the poor are represented, how they are completely the opposite of what the rich think of them, how they are patient. So you could argue that they are patient because of the amount of things they put up with. They are patient because they're still kind despite being poor and destitute. They're still patient despite the illnesses and the ailments that they can't get rid of, or they can't get help for. They're mild, so they're not brash, they're not rude, they're not rowdy, they're not arrogant. So Tim's good qualities, patience and mild, are included as contrasts to the Scrooge we met in Stave 1 as well. So remember, Scrooge is the representation of the rich, okay, and these poorer characters are the representation of the poor. So seeing how differently Dickens presents the two, rich versus poor, you could say, is really, really important as well. Although he was a little, no, never father, sorry, where were we? No, never father, they all cried again. I am very happy, said little Bob. I am very happy. Mrs. Cratchit kissed him, his daughters kissed him, the two young Cratchits kissed him, and Peter and himself shook hands. Spirit of Tiny Tim, thy childish essence was from God. So Tiny Tim, having a childish essence from God, creates an image of universal sympathy and a message to readers about how good the poor can be, to challenge their probably Scrooge-like views. So this also echoes the Ghost of Christmas Present's words about how, in the sight of God, Tiny Tim is better than Scrooge. Remember what we saw in stave 3. So perhaps you can go back and find these quotes so that you can connect them all together. It's really important to see how Dickens always presents or provides angelic descriptions for Tiny Tim, almost like he is very much angelic. So can you perhaps go back and find them and maybe jot them down in the comments? Spectre, said Scrooge, something informs me that our parting moment is at hand. I know it, but I know not how. Tell me what man that was whom we saw lying dead. The ghost of Christmas yet to come conveyed him, as before, though at a different time, he thought. Indeed, there seemed no order in these latter visions, save that they were in the future, into the resorts of businessmen, but showed him not himself. Indeed, the spirit did not stay for anything, but went straight on, as to the end just now desired, until besought by Scrooge to tarry for a moment. This court, said Scrooge, through which we hurry now, is where my place of occupation is, and has been for a length of time. I see the house. Let me behold what I shall be in days to come. So again, he doesn't know that it's him that's died. He just thinks the ghost of Christmas future is taking him to show him where he is in the future, and little does he know that he's actually died in this scene. The spirit stopped. The hand was pointed elsewhere. The house is yonder, Scrooge exclaimed. Why do you point that way? Point away. So he's saying my house is that way. Why are you pointing away from it? The inexorable finger underwent no change. Scrooge hastened to the window of his office and looked in. It was an office still, but not his. The furniture was not the same, and the figure in the chair was not himself. The phantom pointed as before. He joined it once again, and wondering why and whither he had gone, accompanied it until they reached an iron gate. He paused to look round before entering. A churchyard. Here, then, the wretched man whose name he had now to learn lay underneath the ground. It was a worthy place, walled in by houses, overrun by grass and weeds, the growth of vegetation, death, not life, choked up with too much burying, fat with repleted appetite, a worthy place. So I'm just going to actually comment here about how this description contrasts hugely with the description of Tiny Tim's grave. So the description of Scrooge's grave contrasts greatly with Tiny Tim's grave. Tiny Tim's grave is luscious with grass and vibrant with greenery, whilst Scrooge's is unkempt and dead, almost like Scrooge himself. You could say that their graves are almost symbolic of the effect they had on people. So Tiny Tim brought happiness and joy, whilst Scrooge brought misery to people, and that their graves are symbolic of that. A worthy place. The spirit stood among the graves and pointed down to one. He advanced towards it, trembling. The phantom was exactly as it had been, but he dreaded that he saw a new meaning in its solemn shape. So Scrooge dreaded that he saw a new meaning in its solemn shape. Is perhaps Scrooge seeing the ghost as death itself? "Before I draw nearer to that stone to which you point," said Scrooge, "answer me one question. Are these the shadows of the things that will be, or are they the shadows of things that may be only?" Still the ghost pointed downward to the grave by which it stood. "Men's courses will foreshadow certain ends to which, if preserved in, they must lead," said Scrooge. "But if the courses be departed from, the ends will change. Say it is thus with you, with what you show me." The spirit was immovable as ever. Scrooge, so he really wants to know whether these events that he's shown. So I think he's realised at this point that it is him that's died, and he just really wants to know whether there's any way of changing what's happened, what he's showing him, or whether these things are actually going to happen, and there's no way of changing them. Scrooge crept towards it, trembling as he went, and following the finger, read upon the stone of the neglected grave his own name, Ebenezer Scrooge. "Am I that man who lay upon the bed?" he cried, upon his knees. So he just realised that he's the man that lay upon the bed without the curtains that that Mrs. Dilber stole the curtains from. So Scrooge drops to his knees when he sees his name upon the grave, taking up a position of prayer, and therefore showing his fear of retribution and his need for redemption as well. The finger pointed from the grave to him, and back again. "No, spirit, oh no, no!" The finger still was there. "Spirit," he cried, tight, clutching at its robe, "hear me, I am not the man I was. I will not be the man I must have been but for this intercourse. Why show me this if I am past all hope?" For the first time the hand appeared to shake. "Good spirit," he pursued, as down upon the ground he fell before it, "your nature intercedes for me and pities me. Assure me that I yet may change these shadows you have shown me by an altered life." The kind hand trembled. So the ghost's hands being described as kind now could suggest that the future is no longer so bleak and terrifying now that Scrooge understands his mistakes. "I will honour Christmas in my heart and try to keep it all year." So keeping Christmas all year means he will live to uphold the values of Christmas, so values like charity, forgiveness, community. "I will live in the past, the present, and the future. The spirits of all three shall strive within me. I will not shut out the lessons that they teach. Oh, tell me I may sponge away the writing on this stone." In his agony he caught the spectral hand. It sought to free itself, but he was strong in his entreaty and detained it. The spirit, stronger yet, repulsed him. Holding up his hands in a last prayer to have his fates reversed, he saw an alteration in the phantom's hood and dress. It shrunk, collapsed, and dwindled down into a bedpost. So we're going to stop here. In the next episode, we will be starting on stave 5. Stave 5 is a really short scene, so it won't take us too long at all. These are the bits that you need to add to your quotation booklet if you have managed to print it off. If you haven't yet, then it is in the description box below, a link for it. So these are the quotations that we have added from the section that we've read today. So you might want to pause it here so you can jot these down. And this is the bit, this little bit here is the bits that we've added for the context section of the booklet. So this is from the last episode, and this is from this episode. So infant and child death was incredibly common during the 19th century. The death of Tiny Tim is a purposeful lesson for the contemporary readership, so that they can see how their ignorance of the poor affects innocent children. Okay, thank you so much for joining me today. If you are finding our videos useful, then please remember to comment, like, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Thank you so much. Bye.